Welcome to Lore of the Rings, where we explore the secret paths of Middle-earth and share the stories Tolkien never told. Before we dive in, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and whether this tale has found you by day or by night. There is a silence that lives in stone, not the quiet of rest, nor the hush of reverence, but the silence of things that have learned to hold their breath. A stillness born of terror so deep it has calcified into the very bedrock of the world. In the darkest corner of Mordor, where the mountains of shadow fold upon themselves like the wings of some primordial beast, there stands a tower. Its name is whispered even now in the fading tongues of the West. Cirith Ungol, the pass of the spider, the cleft of shadow, the place where light itself learned to recoil. This is not a tale of heroes, though heroes passed through its gates. Nor is it a chronicle of battles, though blood enough was spilled upon its ancient stones to drown a lesser fortress. No, this is something older, something that dwells in the spaces between Tolkien's words, in the silences that punctuate his darkest chapters. This is the story of a place even the servants of the Dark Lord feared to enter. Picture, if you will, the approach. The winding ascent through paths carved not by the hand of man, but by something far more patient, far more deliberate. Stones slick with moisture that has no earthly source, glistening in what little light penetrates this realm of perpetual dusk. The air here is thick, not merely with mist, but with presence. Something watches. Something has always watched. The road, if it can be called such, narrows as it climbs. On either side, the mountains loom like titans frozen in some ancient act of violence, their peaks lost in clouds that never move, never change. And there, ahead, rising from the very throat of the pass itself, the tower. Even from a distance, even shrouded in the gray veils of Mordor's eternal twilight, Cirith Ungol emanates wrongness. Its walls are black, yes, but not the black of night or shadow, rather the black of things that have been burned from within, scorched by fires that consume not wood but essence itself. The stones seem to absorb what little light touches them, drinking it down into depths that have no bottom. But it is the windows that truly unsettle the soul. Narrow slits carved into the tower's face, angled not outward toward the realm of the enemy, but inward, toward the pass itself, toward Shelob's domain, toward the very path that any who would enter must traverse. They gleam sometimes, those windows, catching reflections of things that are not there. Or perhaps, and this is the thought that stops the heart, they gleam with their own light, a phosphorescence born of accumulated malice. The chroniclers of Gondor, in those rare texts that speak of this place at all, used curious language. They did not write of guarding Cirith Ungol, nor of defending it. The word they used again and again in those fading manuscripts was containing, as though the tower's purpose was not to keep invaders out, but to keep something in. And perhaps they were wiser than they knew. For as we descend through the layers of this history, as we peel back the centuries like the petals of some poisonous flower, we will discover that Cirith Ungol is more than architecture. It is more than a strategic outpost in the eternal war between light and shadow. It is a wound, a place where the fabric of Ardor itself has been torn, where the malice of ages has pooled and festered and taken on a life of its own. The bones scattered along the approach tell their own story. Not merely orc and man, but creatures whose very skeletons speak of older, stranger epics. Things with too many limbs, things with skulls shaped wrong. And everywhere, always, the web's gossamer threads thick as ship's cables, strung between the rocks like the rigging of some vast and terrible vessel sailing seas of darkness. Even the orcs, Those creatures who knew no fear of death, who laughed in the face of torment, who served the Dark Lord with a devotion born of terror and spite. Even they walked softly here. Even they cast glances over their shoulders at the tower's silent bulk. Even they, in their crude and brutal tongue, had songs about Cirith Ungol, songs that were not sung in celebration, but in warning. "Where the webs whisper," they would mutter, making signs against evil that predated Sauron himself. "The stones remember." What did the stones remember? What had they witnessed in the long centuries of their standing? What had soaked into their fabric, bone deep, marrow deep, until the very mortar between them became a medium for madness? We are about to discover answers to questions that perhaps should never have been asked. We are about to walk corridors where even the darkness kept to the walls. We are about to enter rooms where silence itself has texture, weight, intent. The tower stands. It has always stood. Through the rising and falling of kingdoms, through the march of ages, through wars that shook the foundations of the world, Cirith Ungol endures. Not as a monument to strength, but as a testament to something far more terrible. The simple, awful truth that some places, once touched by evil, never truly recover. They become reservoirs of malice, batteries charged with accumulated suffering, until the boundary between structure and entity begins to blur. But I am getting ahead of myself. The tale must be told in its proper order, layer by layer, stone by stone. For this is no simple chronicle of military architecture or strategic positioning. This is an archaeology of darkness itself, a descent into depths where even Sauron's gaze, it is said, would sometimes waver and turn aside. The mist thickens as we approach the gates. Those great iron doors, scarred by claws that could rend steel, burned by fires that left marks shaped like hands or things that were almost hands. The threshold beckons. Beyond lies the truth of Cirith Ungol, and truths once seen can never be unseen. So come. The tower waits. It has waited for so very long. But something far older than the Orcs dwelled here, and even Sauron's gaze turned aside. To understand what Cirith Ungol became, we must first comprehend what it was. Long before the Dark Lord's return, before even the shadow of his shadow fell upon these mountains, there stood here a fortress of Gondor. This is not speculation, but fact gleaned from the fragments of lore that survive in the libraries of Minas Tirith. Those texts too damaged or too disturbing to be displayed openly, but too significant to be destroyed. The tower was raised in the latter days of the Second Age, when Gondor stood at the height of its power, and the vigilance of men reached even unto the borders of Mordor. It was one of several watchposts along the Jueth, designed to give early warning should the darkness ever stir again in the land Sauron had claimed for his own. They called it Tal Ungol then, the Vigilant Height, a name of hope, of defiance. Its stones were quarried from the mountains themselves, each block blessed by the priests of the West, each wall raised with songs of warding. For a time, how long the records do not clearly say, it served its purpose. Watchers stood upon its ramparts. Signal fires burned on its heights. It was a finger of light thrust into the throat of darkness. But the light did not hold. The first mystery is this: why was Tal Ungol abandoned? The historical record grows murky here, contradictory. Some texts speak of a plague that swept through the garrison, leaving men alive, but changed. Unwilling to speak of what they had seen in the deep watches of the night. Unable to remain within the tower's walls without succumbing to fits of violence or catatonia. Other sources hint at something more deliberate, a strategic withdrawal as Gondor's power waned and its borders contracted. Resources were scarce. Manpower dwindled. The far watches were recalled, and Cirith Ungol was left to the wind and the silence. But a third possibility exists, one whispered in the footnotes of the most ancient texts, that the tower was not abandoned but yielded. That in the depths of one particular winter, when the darkness seemed to press close even at noon, when the stars themselves grew dim above the Jueth, something came to the pass. Something that made even the bravest warriors of Gondor lay down their spears and walk, empty-eyed and silent, down the long road westward, never to speak of what transpired. Whatever the truth, the outcome was the same. The light of Gondor fled these walls. The banners rotted, the songs faded, and into that vacuum, inevitably, inexorably, darkness crept. Not immediately, not all at once. Darkness is patient, it knows how to wait. And so the tower stood empty for decades, perhaps centuries, a shell, a husk, stone without purpose, architecture without intent. But in Middle-earth, nothing remains truly empty. The land remembers. Stone has memory. And Cirith Ungol had been built upon a place of power, a natural cleft in the mountains where the barriers between seen and unseen grew thin. The builders of Gondor had known this, had chosen this site precisely because such places could be anchored, sanctified, turned from points of weakness to bastions of strength. Yet sanctification is not permanent. It is a constant effort, a ceaseless vigilance. And when that vigilance ended, when the prayers ceased and the songs fell silent, the nature of the place began to reassert itself. The stones forgot their blessing. The walls remembered older loyalties. Archaeological evidence, such as could be gathered in the years following the War of the Ring, suggests that the tower's transformation was gradual. First, the wind began to avoid it, creating an eerie stillness in the pass. Then lichens and mosses that had clung to the stone died back, leaving the walls bare and black. Travelers who passed by in those intermediate years reported feeling watched, feeling an inexplicable compulsion to hurry, to not look too closely at the tower's darkening bulk. And then she came. The chronology is uncertain, but Shelob's claiming of the pass seems to have occurred sometime in the early Third Age. Whether she was drawn by the tower or the tower somehow called to her, this is a question that has no clear answer. But what is known, what can be documented through the unfortunate testimonies of those few who escaped her lair, is that once she established her domain in the tunnels beneath Cirith Ungol, the tower's transformation accelerated. It was as though the structure had been waiting for her. As though it recognized in Shelob's ancient hunger something kindred to its own nascent awareness. The two entities, if entity is the word, achieved a kind of symbiosis. She would feed in the tunnels below, her webs expanding into a labyrinth of death. And above, the tower would watch, its windows gleaming with that strange phosphorescence, its walls drinking in the terror of those who entered the pass. By the time Sauron returned to Mordor, Cirith Ungol had become something entirely other than what Gondor had built. The foundations remained, yes. The basic architecture was unchanged. But the nature of the place, its essential character, had inverted completely. What had been raised as a beacon against darkness had become a monument to it. And the Dark Lord, in his vast and terrible wisdom, recognized the utility of this transformation. He did not rebuild Cirith Ungol. He did not need to. Instead, he simply populated it. He staffed it with orcs, those creatures who were themselves inversions of what they had once been. He made it a garrison once more, but now facing inward, guarding not against the darkness but for it. The light of Gondor fled these walls, But darkness does not waste what men abandon. To speak of Cirith Ungol without speaking of Shelob is to tell only half the tale, and the lesser half at that. She is the true queen of this cursed place, the beating heart of its horror. Yet she is more than mere monster, more than simple predator. Shelob is a remnant, a fragment of something so ancient and so terrible that her very existence is an affront to the ordered world. Her lineage traces back to Ungoliant, that primordial horror who existed before the sun and moon, before light itself was kindled in the world. Ungoliant, who drank the light of the two trees and brought darkness to Valinor. Ungoliant, whose hunger was so vast, so insatiable that even Morgoth himself, the first Dark Lord, came to fear her. In the end, it is said, she devoured herself in the forgotten corners of the world, mad with starvation. But before that final dissolution, she spawned. And of all her offspring, Shelob alone survived the cataclysms that ended the First Age. While her siblings perished in the breaking of Beleriand, while the world was reformed and reshaped, Shelob fled into the darkest places, the deepest clefts, the shadows so profound that even the new sun could not touch them. And there she waited. Through the Second Age, through the rising and falling of kingdoms, through epics that would have seen ordinary creatures die 1,000 times over, Shelob endured. Because hunger of that depth, that purity, does not simply fade. It sustains. It preserves. The tunnels beneath Cirith Ungol became her realm sometime in the early Third Age, as I have said. But realm is too small a word. She did not simply occupy those passages, she transformed them. Her webs were not mere traps, but a vast nervous system, a sensory network that extended throughout the mountain's depths. Every vibration, every footfall, every breath drawn in those tunnels was known to her. The passages themselves became extensions of her will, angles and turns shaped over centuries to funnel prey toward her hunger. Those who entered her domain described, in the moments before terror stole speech, a peculiar quality to the air. It was not simply fetid, not merely thick with the stench of decay. There was a heaviness to it, a density that seemed to resist being breathed, as though the atmosphere itself had become saturated with her presence. Some spoke of a sound, barely audible at first, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A rhythmic clicking, a dry whisper of chitin on stone, that followed them through twisting corridors and never quite resolved into definable direction. Her size defied comprehension. Accounts varied wildly, but the consensus among scholars who have studied the few reliable testimonies is that Shelob was perhaps 30 feet in length, her bulbous body swollen with centuries of feeding, her legs spanning corridors carved for the passage of men as easily as a normal spider spans a windowsill. Her eyes, and here the accounts become particularly disturbing, numbered beyond count, clusters of them glittering in the darkness like malevolent constellations, each one holding a fragment of an intelligence vast and utterly alien to the children of Iluvatar. But intelligence she possessed, make no mistake. Shelob was no mere beast acting on instinct. She was aware. She planned. She remembered. Those who had escaped her once and foolishly returned found her waiting, prepared for their specific tactics, as though she had spent the intervening time studying their methods, anticipating their movements. Tolkien himself, in that passage of dark poetry that describes Frodo's encounter with her, gave us perhaps the most chilling insight into her nature. No such anguish had Shelob ever known, or dreamed of knowing in all her long world of wickedness. Not life of wickedness, mark you, but world. As though she herself had become an entire cosmos of malice, a universe unto herself defined solely by hunger and cruelty, and her relationship with Sauron. Here we encounter one of the great mysteries of the lore. The Dark Lord knew of her, certainly. He permitted her to remain in the pass, even encouraged her presence there, understanding that she served as the most effective guardian imaginable. No army could march through those tunnels. No spy could slip past her web. The pass was sealed more effectively by her presence than by any wall or gate, yet he did not command her, could not command her. Shelob was older than his current incarnation, older than his power in Mordor, descended from a being that had brought terror even to Morgoth. She served Sauron's purposes only insofar as they aligned with her own endless appetite. She was allied to him not through fear or loyalty, but through simple coincidence of interest. And he, in turn, feared her. The texts are subtle on this point, speaking around it rather than addressing it directly, but the implication is clear. Sauron, who bent kingdoms to his will, who commanded armies of orcs and men, who held dominion over all Mordor, Sauron gave Shelob a wide berth. He did not test her patience. He did not seek to bind her to his service through sorcery or threat. He left her to her tunnels and her webs and her endless, gnawing hunger. This is significant. This tells us something crucial about the nature of the horror that lurked beneath Cirith Ungol. We are not speaking here of a creature under the Dark Lord's control, but of an independent power, a chaos that existed parallel to his order, predating his schemes and likely to outlast his dominion. The Orcs understood this better than most. In their crude hierarchy of fears, Shelob occupied a special place. They feared Sauron, yes, but that fear was mingled with a strange pride. They were his servants, terrible in his name. But Shelob they feared with a purity that approached religious awe. She was not of Mordor's order. She was something older, something that did not fit into their understanding of master and slave, commander and commanded. They would not enter her tunnels except under the most extreme duress. They knew the paths that skirted her domain and took them always, even when it meant hours of additional travel through treacherous terrain. And on those occasions when duty or desperation forced them to pass through the cleft of shadow, they went in groups, weapons drawn, moving with a silence born not of stealth but of dread, speaking only in whispers and never tarrying. Some among them claimed they could feel her through the stone, that when they pressed close to certain walls, they could sense her below, the vast weight of her, the slow pulse of her alien life. They spoke of dreams, too, those orcs who were stationed in Cirith Ungol. Dreams of being wrapped in silk, unable to move, watching with paralyzed eyes as something approached through the darkness, something whose form the mind refused to properly register, fracturing perception itself. And strangest of all, they believed the tower itself was somehow aware of her, that it listened to the scrape of her legs in the deep places, that it took a kind of nourishment from the death she wrought. The two, they whispered, were connected. Not physically, there was no passage between the tunnels and the tower's interior, but in some other way, through channels that existed outside the normal flow of space and causation. Were they mad, these orcs, driven to delusion by the horror of their posting? Perhaps. Or perhaps they perceived, in their crude and visceral way, something that more civilized minds would deny. That Cirith Ungol and Shelob were two aspects of a single phenomenon, a doubling of darkness, each amplifying the other's malice. No orc crossed her tunnels unbidden, and those who entered were seldom wholly themselves when they emerged. The garrison of Cirith Ungol, in the days before its fall, numbered perhaps 300 orcs, a significant force by any standard, yet dwarfed by the vast armies that Sauron commanded. This was not a place where warriors were sent to win glory or advancement. This was a posting of punishment and penance, an assignment given to those who had displeased the Dark Lord's captains, but not so gravely as to merit death. To be sent to Cirith Ungol was to be exiled to fear itself. 2 captains commanded this cursed garrison in the final days of the War of the Ring, Shagrat and Gorbag. Their names have survived in the fragments of records kept by Gondor's archivists, pieced together from the testimony of scouts and the few documents recovered from the tower after its fall. But more than names, we have something rarer. We have their voices, preserved in that remarkable passage where Tolkien allows us to eavesdrop on their conversation, to hear orcs speaking not as mindless servants of evil, but as beings with their own grudges, fears, and bitter dreams. Shagrat was the senior of the 2, commander of the tower's garrison proper. The descriptions we have paint him as large even by orc standards, scarred extensively, with a cunning that bordered on intelligence. He ruled through a combination of brutality and a strange, twisted competence, keeping order in a place where chaos was always one misstep away, maintaining discipline among creatures whose natural inclination was toward violence and treachery. It could not have been easy. The tower's atmosphere, the constant proximity to Shelob's domain, the sheer isolation of the posting, all of this wore on the garrison. Fights were common. Desertions, though rare, for where could one desert to in Mordor, were not unknown. And beneath it all, the sense that the stones themselves were watching, judging, waiting for weakness. Gorbag commanded a different force, a company from Minas Morgul, sent to reinforce the tower during the war's final days. He was, in some ways, Shagrat's opposite, smaller, quicker, more given to mockery than brute force. But his eyes, those few who saw him reported, held a particular cruelty, a delight in others, suffering that marked him as dangerous in a different way than simple violence. The 2 despised each other. This was clear from their first meeting. Territorial disputes, disagreements over authority, personal animosity, all the petty hatreds that fester in close quarters were magnified here, in this place where darkness pressed close and trust was a forgotten concept. Yet in their conversation, captured in Tolkien's text with remarkable fidelity, we hear something unexpected: weariness. A profound exhaustion not merely of body but of spirit. They speak of desertion, of fleeing, where there's no big bosses. Gorbag dreams aloud of a place where he might simply exist, taking orders from no one but ourselves. These are not the words of mindless monsters. These are the laments of slaves who have caught, however dimly, a glimpse of what freedom might mean. And in that glimpse, we see the tragedy of what orcs are. Creatures corrupted, yes, but not beyond all recognition. Beings capable of thought, of desire, of imagining a different existence, yet trapped utterly in the machinery of the Dark Lord's will. Cirith Ungol amplified this tragedy. The tower was not merely a military installation, but a microcosm of Mordor itself. A hierarchy maintained through fear, a system where trust was death, where the only certainty was betrayal. The walls themselves seemed to encourage discord, whispers in the dark, misunderstandings that escalated into violence, suspicions that festered into certainty. Shagrat and Gorbag's rivalry came to a head over Frodo's mithril coat, that shirt of dwarven rings worth more than all of Mordor. Each saw in it a key to escape, to power, to a different life. And so they turned on each other, their companies following suit, and Cirith Ungol became an abattoir. The battle, if it can be called such, was less a military engagement than a mutual slaughter. The accounts pieced together from the aftermath speak of a frenzy, a madness that swept through both companies. They fought not in the courtyard or the pass, but within the tower itself, through corridors and up staircases, painting the black stones with darker stains. They fought in the armories and barracks, in the storage halls and guard rooms. They fought until there was almost no one left to fight, torchlight flickering on blood-slick walls, the screams echoing through empty chambers, bouncing off stones that seemed to absorb the sound, to drink it down like wine. The smell of death, so thick it became visible as a haze in the air. And through it all, the tower watching, its silent windows gleaming, as though it were feeding on the violence, growing fat on the terror and pain. When Samwise Gamgee finally entered, climbing the endless stair to rescue Frodo, he found not a fortress but a tomb. Bodies everywhere, the reek of death so overwhelming it stopped his breath, and silence, that peculiar, heavy silence that follows great violence, when even the stones seem stunned by what they've witnessed. Yet not all had perished. Shagrat survived, dragging himself to the dark tower with his prize, bearing news of the catastrophe. But his survival was, in many ways, the cruelest fate. For he had to face Sauron's wrath, had to explain how a garrison of 300 had been reduced to carrion by their own hands, how discipline had shattered so completely that an entire post was lost not to the enemy, but to internecine slaughter. The Dark Lord's punishment is not recorded. One imagines it was thorough, but the greater punishment was perhaps Cirith Ungol's own. For the tower had cultivated this catastrophe, had nurtured the seeds of discord until they blossomed into bloodshed. It had turned the Orcs against themselves with a precision that suggested something more than mere malign influence. Suggested, perhaps, intent. The stones of Cirith Ungol had been raised by Gondor to stand against darkness. Now, corrupted beyond recognition, they had learned to corrupt in turn. They had become teachers of treachery, architects of betrayal. They had taken Sauron's servants and shown them that there was no escape, no peace, no possibility of anything but violence and death. This was Cirith Ungol's true purpose, revealed at last, not to guard, not to watch, but to destroy. To take whatever entered its walls and break it, unmake it, reduce it to its basest components, and then scatter even those to the wind. By dawn, only silence ruled Cirith Ungol, and the tower's stones drank the blood of their keepers. Now we come to the heart of the matter, the central mystery, the question that has haunted scholars of Tolkien's lore since first they encountered this cursed place in the pages of The Two Towers and The Return of the King. Was Cirith Ungol merely a fortress? Or was it something more? Consider the evidence carefully. Set aside preconceptions about what a building can or cannot be. In a world where swords bear curses, where rings hold dominion over wills, where trees can walk and mountains can think, in such a world, why not a tower that lives? The architecture itself speaks volumes to those who know how to listen. Cirith Ungol was not built to any standard military design. Its angles are wrong corridors that lead to nowhere, staircases that spiral in directions that seem to shift depending on the hour, windows positioned not for defense or observation, but for purposes that defy military logic. Those who explored the tower after the war reported feeling constantly disoriented, despite maps and careful notation. Distances seemed to stretch or compress. Rooms remembered from one visit were unreachable in the next. This was attributed, at the time, to damage from the war, to the disorientation of those traumatized by their experiences in Mordor. But an alternative explanation exists, that the tower's internal geography was never fixed, that it shifted and changed according to its own inscrutable purposes. The windows deserve special attention. I mentioned them earlier, but their significance cannot be overstated. They were not merely openings but eyes, and Tolkien's text describes them explicitly as such. When Sam approached the tower, he saw two great watchers, silent sentinels carved in stone, positioned at the gate. But more than these, the windows themselves seemed to regard him, to follow his movements with a gaze that was neither mortal nor wholesome. In Tolkien's metaphysics, perception and being are intertwined. To be watched is to be known, and to be known is to be, in some sense, possessed. The Eye of Sauron is the ultimate expression of this principle, a gaze that not merely observes but dominates, imposing the Dark Lord's will upon whatever falls under its scrutiny. But what if Cirith Ungol had developed its own form of sight? Not as powerful as Sauron's, certainly, but present nonetheless. A local awareness, limited to the tower and its immediate environs, but within that sphere, absolute. The Orcs seemed to believe this in their way. Their behavior within the tower's walls was markedly different from their conduct outside. They moved more carefully, spoke more softly, watched their companions with greater suspicion, as though they believed the tower might somehow report infractions, betrayals, whispered doubts. And they avoided certain areas entirely, sealed chambers, forgotten wings, entire levels of the tower that had been abandoned not due to disrepair but due to something else. Something that even orcs, creatures bred to fearlessness, could not face. What lurked in those sealed places? The records are silent. Those who entered after the war did not penetrate to those depths, or if they did not report what they found. But rumors persisted in Gondor for years afterward. Stories of chambers where shadows moved against the light, where words spoken aloud would echo back in voices that were not quite the speaker's own. Of places where time itself seemed to thicken, where minutes stretched to hours and hours compressed to heartbeats. One particularly disturbing account, dismissed by most scholars as the product of trauma or imagination, described a room at the tower's heart that should not, by all architectural logic, have existed. A circular chamber without doors or windows, accessed only through a narrow crack in what should have been a solid wall. Within, the witness claimed, were carvings, but not carved into the walls. Carved by the walls, pushed out from within the stone itself, as though the rock were flesh that had grown tumorous with malice. Whether this account holds any truth is impossible to determine now. The tower was left to ruin after the war, and subsequent rock slides and the general collapse of Mordor's infrastructure have made thorough exploration impossible. But the story persists, and in its persistence lies a kind of truth, the truth of what people believed Cirith Ungol to be, and belief in Middle-earth has power. Let us consider the tower's relationship with Sauron himself. The Dark Lord garrisoned Cirith Ungol, yes, but he did not improve it, did not fortify it beyond what already existed, did not place there any of his great captains or cherished lieutenants. He treated it less as a military asset and more as a natural feature, like a mountain range or river, something to be worked around, incorporated into strategy, but not directly controlled. Why? If the tower were simply stone and mortar, why not rebuild it entirely, reshape it to his purposes as he had reshaped all of Mordor? The answer, I propose, is that he could not. Or rather, that he recognized something in Cirith Ungol that made alteration unwise, that the tower had achieved a kind of equilibrium, a balance of malice and structure, and that to disturb that balance might invite catastrophe. Remember, Sauron had experience with rebellious architecture. Barad-dûr itself was bound to him through the One Ring, would stand only so long as the ring endured. He understood, better than perhaps any other being in Middle-earth, that great works of dark making could achieve a kind of autonomy, could become repositories of will and power that existed semi-independently of their creator. What if Cirith Ungol had achieved such autonomy? Not through Sauron's design, but through centuries of exposure to Shelob's presence, to the countless deaths within and around it, to the accumulated malice of every orc who had served there, every prisoner who had died in its dungeons, every traveler who had perished in Shelob's webs. Stone has memory. This is a principle Tolkien returned to again and again in his works. The stones of Orthanc remembered their making and could not be broken. The paths of the dead remembered oaths sworn and would not release the oath breakers until those vows were fulfilled. Why not a tower that remembered every drop of blood spilled upon it, every scream echoed through its halls, every act of treachery and cruelty performed within its walls? And if stone can remember, why not learn? Why not, over centuries, begin to understand cause and effect, stimulus and response? Why not develop, in some alien and incomprehensible way, something that might be called thought? This is the revelation at the heart of Cirith Ungol's mystery, that the tower became, through long exposure to evil and the accumulation of malice, a kind of entity. Not alive in any biological sense, not conscious in the way we understand consciousness, but aware nonetheless. Aware and hungry. For what? Not for food in any conventional sense, but for suffering, perhaps. For the delicious terror that radiated from those who entered its gates. For the exquisite anguish of betrayal, the sharp spike of violence, the slow decay of hope. It fed on these things the way Shelob fed on flesh, drawing them in, savoring them, growing fat on the psychic energies they represented. And it learned to cultivate such energies, to create conditions that would maximize fear, amplify hatred, ensure that those within its walls would tear each other apart. The layout that disoriented, the windows that watched, the silence that pressed heavy on the spirit, the cold that had nothing to do with temperature. All of these were not merely consequences of the tower's corruption, but tools it employed to harvest the emotional and spiritual suffering of those within. This explains why even Sauron's gaze turned aside. Not from fear, precisely, but from a kind of recognition. The Dark Lord saw in Cirith Ungol a reflection of his own nature, the same hunger, the same endless appetite for dominion and destruction, and in that recognition, perhaps, a wariness. For Sauron's power was vast but not infinite, and he had learned, through bitter experience, that entities of similar nature do not always cooperate. Sometimes they compete. Better, then, to leave Cirith Ungol to its own devices, to let it serve his purposes without trying to bend it fully to his will. A détente between powers, each malign in its own way, each content to pursue its own dark pleasures so long as they did not directly conflict. This interpretation, I am aware, stretches the boundaries of what we can definitively claim from the text. Tolkien never explicitly states that Cirith Ungol possessed sentience or will, but he surrounds the tower with language that suggests something beyond mere architecture. The watching windows, the oppressive atmosphere that Sam describes as being like an unseen barrier. The way the tower seems to wait, to anticipate. And there is this, from Sam's perspective as he prepares to enter. The tower, which had looked sometimes so narrow and so tall, now looked incredibly strong and vast and unassailable, a great fortress of stone and iron, vast and solid in its evil power. Not in evil design or evil purpose, mark you, but in evil power as though the evil were intrinsic, radiating from the tower itself rather than merely associated with its function. Perhaps the orcs did not guard the tower. Perhaps the tower guarded them. The fall of Cirith Ungol did not come through siege or assault. No army battered at its gates. No siege engines hurled stones against its walls. Instead, the tower was undone from within, a collapse that began with the internal slaughter of its garrison and culminated in the breaking of Sauron's will. We have already spoken of the battle between Shagrat and Gorbag's forces, that frenzy of violence that left the tower's corridors choked with corpses. But the true beginning of Cirith Ungol's fall came earlier, in the tunnels below, when a hobbit bearing the One Ring walked into Shelob's domain. Frodo's confrontation with Shelob was, in many ways, the first crack in a dam that had held for millennia. The spider had reigned unchallenged in those passages for so long that the concept of defeat was alien to her. She was ancient, vast, invulnerable. She had weathered the ages and outlasted kingdoms. What could a halfling, even one bearing an artifact of power, do against her? And yet, through the intervention of Samwise Gamgee wielding the file of Galadriel and the blade's sting, Shelob was wounded. Not killed, she was far too mighty for that, but hurt deeply, driven back into her deepest lairs where even the tower's awareness could not follow. For the first time in uncounted centuries, she fled. This mattered. Not merely for Frodo's quest, though that was paramount, but for Cirith Ungol itself. Remember the symbiosis I described earlier, the connection between spider and tower. When Shelob was wounded, that connection was severed, or at least severely damaged. The tower found itself suddenly alone, its companion in darkness diminished, its source of sustenance interrupted. Perhaps this is what triggered the garrison's self-destruction. Perhaps the tower, feeling Shelob's retreat, lashed out in rage or fear, amplifying the existing tensions between the orcs until they exploded into violence. Or perhaps it was simple chaos, the natural consequence of a system held together solely by terror finally fragmenting under pressure. Regardless of cause, the effect was catastrophic. By the time Sam began his desperate climb to rescue Frodo, the tower was a charnel house. Bodies lay everywhere, in the courtyard, on the stairs, in the passages. The reek of death hung so thick it was visible, a haze that turned the torchlight murky and indistinct. Sam's ascent through this nightmare is one of the most harrowing passages in all of Tolkien's work. He climbed through silence broken only by his own footfalls and ragged breathing, past corpses whose wounds told stories of betrayal and rage, through chambers where blood had pooled so deep it splashed against his feet. And all the while, the sense of being watched, of something vast and malevolent observing his progress with interest that was neither hostile nor benign, but utterly alien. When he finally reached the chamber where Frodo was held, he found it guarded by the last remaining orcs, those who had survived the slaughter through luck or cowardice, and who now looked upon Sam with eyes that held more fear than aggression. They fled before him, these hardened warriors of Mordor, fled from a hobbit who should have been beneath their notice. Fled not because of Sam himself, but because they sensed that the tower's protection had been withdrawn, that the walls which had sheltered them now offered only cold stone and shadows. The rescue itself was almost anticlimactic after such buildup. Frodo was freed. Together, the hobbits descended through the tower, encountering no resistance, walking corridors that should have been teeming with guards, but instead echoed with emptiness. It was as though Cirith Ungol, having lost both Shelob and its garrison, had simply given up. They passed through the gate, beneath the watching eyes of the stone sentinels, and those great watchers did not stir. Sam, in a moment of defiance or desperation, even challenged them, wielding the file of Galadriel and crying out in the name of light. And the sentinels cracked, their stone bodies fracturing, their vigilance ended. It was a small victory, easily overlooked in the grander scope of the War of the Ring, but symbolically it was profound. The breaking of the Watchers represented the breaking of Cirith Ungol's power, the first true sign that even this most cursed of places could be challenged, could be overcome. Yet the tower itself stood. Even as its garrison perished, even as its gates fell silent, even as Shelob retreated into the deepest dark, Cirith Ungol endured, waiting perhaps for some new purpose, or simply existing as cursed places do, beyond the immediate concerns of war and politics. The final blow came not from any action directed at the tower, but from the destruction of the ring in the fires of Mount Doom. When Sauron's will shattered, when the Dark Lord's consciousness was scattered to the winds, every work of his power trembled. Barad-dûr fell in that moment, its stones at last released from the binding that had held them. The ring-wraiths vanished like mist before the sun, and throughout Mordor, the structures and systems that had depended on Sauron's dominating will began to collapse. Cirith Ungol felt that shattering. How could it not? For centuries, it had existed within the shadow of Sauron's power, had drawn some portion of its own dark vitality from his presence in Mordor. When that presence vanished, the tower found itself suddenly less, diminished. The awareness that had accumulated over centuries flickering, fading, draining away like water through cracked stone. Witnesses from the camps of Gondor, stationed at a distance to watch Mordor's collapse, reported that a great tremor shook the Ephel-Juath at the moment of the ring's destruction. Rockslides cascaded down the mountains, and from Cirith Ungol itself, a sound variously described as a groan, a shriek, or a long, shuddering exhalation, as though the tower itself were releasing a breath held for too many years. When the dust settled, when the tremors ceased, Cirith Ungol still stood. But those who observed it from afar noted a difference. The windows no longer gleamed. The stones, which had seemed to absorb light, now simply looked black, ordinary black, the black of stone rather than of malice. The watching quality, that sense of regard from the tower itself, had faded, not disappeared. Never truly disappeared, but faded, like a voice diminishing into distance, until one could almost believe it had never been there at all. When the ring fell, Cirith Ungol sighed, as though something long imprisoned was at last released. After the war, after the celebrations and the crowning of the king, after the rebuilding of what could be rebuilt and the mourning for what was lost forever, the question arose, what to do with Mordor? The land itself was wounded beyond measure, scarred by Sauron's long dominion, poisoned by the fell industries he had established there. The plains of Gorgoroth were blackened wastelands. Orodruin still smoked, though its fires had cooled. And throughout the realm, fortresses and strongholds stood empty, monuments to a darkness that had been vanquished but whose shadow remained. Cirith Ungol was chief among these troubling ruins. In the councils of Gondor, there was debate about whether it should be dismantled, torn down stone by stone until no trace remained. Some argued that leaving it standing was to invite darkness to return, to provide a ready-made foundation for any future evil that might arise in that cursed land. But others counseled restraint. Tearing down Cirith Ungol would require men to enter it, to work within its walls for weeks or months, to camp within its shadow. And who could say what effect that might have? The tower had broken its garrison of orcs. What might it do to men, even in its diminished state? In the end, the decision was made to leave it, to declare the entire region Cirith Ungol, the tunnels below, the winding path of the pass, forbidden ground. Markers were placed at the approaches, warning in 3 languages that those who entered did so at their own peril and beyond the protection of the king. Few chose to test that warning. Oh, there were some. Treasure hunters, drawn by rumors of orc hordes hidden within the tower. Scholars hoping to recover texts or artifacts that might shed light on Sauron's methods and motivations. Even a few who came seeking spiritual challenge, believing that by facing the darkness of such a place, they might prove their own courage or faith. Most turned back before reaching the gates. Something in the approach, even in those first years when the memory of victory was fresh and the light seemed to have returned to the world, stopped them. A quality to the air. A sense of being watched that grew stronger with each step. The bones of orcs and older things, picked clean by carrion birds but still scattered along the path, speaking eloquently of what awaited those who persisted. The few who entered and returned spoke of emptiness. Corridors choked with debris. Chambers where the ceiling had partially collapsed. The omnipresent smell of decay, though whether from the corpses that still lay where they had fallen or from some quality of the stone itself, none could say. But most of all, they spoke of the silence, a silence so profound it seemed to have weight, to press against the ears until the sound of one's own heartbeat became deafening. And they spoke of dreams. Every one of them, without exception, reported dreams in the nights following their visits to Cirith Ungol. Dreams of being watched by eyes that glittered in the darkness. Dreams of corridors that shifted and changed, leading always deeper into stone that had no depth. Dreams of whispers in a language that was not quite words, but nonetheless carried meaning, terrible meaning that faded upon waking, but left a residue of dread. After a time, the treasure hunters stopped coming. The potential rewards, it seemed, were not worth the price paid in sleepless nights and haunted days. The scholars found other ruins to excavate, other mysteries to unravel. And those seeking spiritual testing learned that there are challenges that prove nothing except the foolishness of accepting them. Cirith Ungol was left to itself. The years passed. A decade, then 2, then more. Vines began to creep up the lower walls, life slowly reclaiming what death had held. Birds, carrion crows at first, then others made nests in the high places. The wind, no longer held at bay by whatever power had kept it from the pass, began to erode the stones, grinding them down grain by grain. Nature was reclaiming Cirith Ungol, in other words. Slowly, to be sure, the tower had been built to endure, and even in ruin it was formidable. But the process had begun. In another century, perhaps, or 2 or 3, the tower would be little more than a pile of rubble, indistinguishable from the mountains that surrounded it. Yet something remained. Those who lived in the lands west of the Jueth, in the valleys that looked toward Mordor, reported seeing lights sometimes in the tower's windows. Not torchlight or firelight, but that same phosphorescent gleam that had been observed in earlier days. It came and went without pattern, visible some nights and absent others, never bright enough to illuminate much, but enough to be seen from miles away. And the moon, when it rose red over Mordor, as it sometimes did, catching the dust and vapors that still occasionally rose from the scarred earth, painted Cirith Ungol in shades of blood. In that light, the tower looked almost alive, its walls seeming to breathe, its windows gleaming like eyes that reflected not the moon but some internal luminance. The locals developed superstitions. They would not walk abroad when the moon rose red. They closed their shutters and barred their doors and told their children stories of the tower that watched, that waited, that remembered. And though the educated men of Gondor dismissed such tales as peasant fancy, none of them chose to spend a red moon night in the shadow of the Jueth to prove their point. Shelob's fate, in those years, was unknown. She had not been seen since her wounding by Sam, and many hoped she had finally succumbed, that the last daughter of Ungoliant had at last perished. But her webs remained, thick and strong, spanning the tunnels beneath the pass. And those webs did not decay as normal spider silk would. They endured year after year until they seemed less like biological material and more like some substance akin to stone or metal. Some whispered that she lived still, deeper in the mountains than she had ever gone before, nursing her wounds and her hatred, waiting for something. Others believed she had died, but that her webs held some fragment of her essence, that they were in some sense still her, still hungry, still aware. Certainly, nothing living entered those tunnels and emerged unchanged. The few foolhardy adventurers who attempted to map Shelob's domain came back speaking in hushed voices of movements in the darkness, of sounds that might have been the scrape of chitin on stone, or might have been the tunnels themselves settling. And all of them, spoke of a sense of hunger that permeated the passages, a gnawing void that seemed to pull at the soul. The connection between tower and tunnels, between Cirith Ungol and Shelob, persisted even in ruin. This much became clear over time. When the lights were seen in the tower's windows, travelers through the lower passes reported feeling watched with particular intensity. When the moon rose red, the webs in the tunnels seemed to tremble, though no wind reached those depths. It was as though the two entities, if entities they were, remained linked, two halves of a greater darkness that had not been fully vanquished, merely diminished, driven down into a kind of hibernation from which it might, under the right circumstances, awaken. And so Cirith Ungol stood through the Fourth Age and beyond, neither fully destroyed nor fully dormant, a scar on the land, a reminder that some evils once established cannot be entirely eradicated. They can only be contained, outlasted, weathered until time itself grinds them down to nothing. But time is long, and darkness is patient, and the tower waits still beneath the red moon in the shadow of the mountains, watching nothing and everything, remembering what it was and dreaming, perhaps, of what it might yet become. Some lights are too pure for such stones, and so they are left to dream beneath the red moon. We come now to the end of this chronicle, to the final meditation on Cirith Ungol and its place in the legendarium of Middle-earth. But endings in Tolkien's world are rarely simple. They echo, they resonate, they carry forward into futures we cannot fully see. Cirith Ungol, I have argued, was more than a fortress, more than a strategic outpost or even a monument to evil. It was, in its way, a lesson, one of many that Tolkien wove into the fabric of his mythology, teaching truths about the nature of corruption, the persistence of darkness, and the price that must be paid for vigilance. Consider the arc of the tower's existence. It began in light built by Gondor at the height of its power, raised with songs and blessings, intended as a bulwark against shadow. For a time, it served that purpose well. It was a place of hope, of defiance, a statement in stone that the works of men could stand against the darkness. But hope, Tolkien reminds us again and again, is not the same as certainty. Vigilance is not permanent. The light may shine brightly for a season or an age, but if it is not tended, if the watchers grow weary or turn away, the darkness will find its opportunity. And darkness is nothing if not opportunistic. The abandonment of Cirith Ungol was not, in itself, evil. It was a practical decision made by leaders who had to allocate limited resources across a vast realm. But abandonment has consequences. When a place of power is yielded, when a bulwark is left unmanned, something will inevitably fill that void. And what fills voids in Middle-earth is rarely benevolent. So the tower that had been raised to stand against evil became a monument to it instead. The stones that had been blessed were cursed. The windows that had watched for enemies learned to watch with malice. It is a transformation we see elsewhere in Tolkien's work Orthanc, turned from a tower of knowledge to a fortress of treachery. Minas Ithil becoming Minas Morgul. Even the two trees themselves, who gave light to Valinor, were poisoned by Ungoliant and their light devoured. This theme runs deep in the professor's mythology, that great works, once corrupted, become terrible inversions of their original purpose. That the higher something rises, the further it has to fall, and that the fall, when it comes, leaves scars that do not easily heal. Cirith Ungol embodies this principle perfectly. It stands as a warning to all who would build great works and then neglect them. It speaks to the necessity of eternal vigilance, not merely in watching for enemies without, but in maintaining the integrity of what we have built, lest it turn against us from within. But there is another lesson here, subtler and perhaps more important. Cirith Ungol reminds us that evil is not always external, not always other. Sometimes it grows from within, fed by our own fears and failures. The tower became what it was not because Sauron imposed his will upon it, but because it was left alone in a place of darkness, abandoned to the slow accumulation of malice, until that malice achieved a kind of critical mass, and the tower itself became evil. This is the horror at the heart of Cirith Ungol, not that it was made evil by some external force, but that it became evil through exposure, through environment, through the gradual erosion of what it had been built to be. It is a horror that speaks to real-world concerns, to the ways in which institutions and structures, left unattended or placed in toxic environments, can themselves become toxic, can transform from protectors to predators, from guardians to abusers. Tolkien, I believe, understood this deeply. He had witnessed, in his lifetime, the corruption of great institutions. He had seen idealism curdled into fanaticism, patriotism twisted into nationalism, the machinery of civilization turned to the purpose of unprecedented slaughter. The Great War had taught him that horrors could emerge not merely from the machinations of villains, but from systems and structures that had taken on a life and a malice of their own. Cirith Ungol is his meditation on this theme, translated into the language of mythology. It is a tower, yes, but it is also every institution that has outlasted its purpose, every structure that has become an end in itself rather than a means. Every watch post that learned to watch not for threats but for victims. Every guardian that became a jailer. And yet, and this is crucial, Cirith Ungol was not invincible. It could be challenged. It could be overcome. Sam's ascent, his rescue of Frodo, proved that even the darkest of places could be penetrated, that even the most terrible of prisons could be escaped. The power of the tower was great, but it was not absolute. It could be resisted. How? Through courage, certainly, Sam possessed that in abundance, but also through love, through loyalty. Through the simple, stubborn refusal to abandon hope even in the face of overwhelming despair. These were the qualities that allowed Sam to climb those stairs, to face down the terror of Cirith Ungol, to wrest his master from the tower's grip. And the tower, for all its accumulated malice, could not stand against those qualities. It could frighten. It could oppress. It could cultivate despair and betrayal and violence. But it could not extinguish love, could not break loyalty, could not defeat the kind of courage that is rooted not in confidence of victory, but in commitment to doing what is right regardless of outcome. This, too, is part of Tolkien's message, that evil, for all its power, has inherent limitations, that there are qualities of spirit against which darkness, however deep, must ultimately yield. Not easily, never easily. Sam's ordeal in Cirith Ungol was harrowing, but it was possible. The tower could be defeated. The darkness could be challenged. When Sauron fell, Cirith Ungol diminished. This is significant. It tells us that the tower's power, while real, was not self-sustaining. It depended, at least in part, on the greater darkness of Mordor, on Sauron's dominating will, on the ecosystem of evil that he had created. When that ecosystem collapsed, Cirith Ungol found itself isolated, cut off from its sources of strength. It did not disappear. It did not crumble instantly to dust, but it diminished. And in that diminishment lies hope. The hope that even the deepest evils, if they are cut off from their sources of power, if they are isolated and contained, will eventually fade. Not quickly. Cirith Ungol still stands, centuries later, still dreaming its dark dreams beneath the red moon. The corruption it embodied did not vanish with Sauron's defeat. Scars remain. Poison persists. The land around the tower is still wounded, still dangerous, still marked by the long years of darkness. But the process of healing has begun. Nature creeps back. The tower erodes. And most importantly, it is known now. It is watched. Not in the sense of garrisoned or guarded, no one wants to repeat that mistake, but watched in the sense of remembered, acknowledged, its nature understood. This is perhaps the final lesson of Cirith Ungol, that evil cannot be ignored into non-existence. It must be acknowledged, understood, remembered. Not obsessed over, not given more power through excessive fear, but remembered. The tower stands in part as a warning, a reminder of what can happen when vigilance fails, when structures are corrupted, when darkness is given room to grow. And so it will remain for however many ages the world endures. A monument, a warning, a scar. The tower of Cirith Ungol, standing alone in the shadow of the mountains, its windows dark but never quite empty, its stones weathering slowly but never quite falling, its silence profound but never quite complete. Those who know the lore speak of it still. They tell the tale to new generations, ensuring that the lessons are not forgotten. They speak of Sam's courage and Frodo's ordeal. They speak of Shelob's hunger and the Orcs' treachery. They speak of the tower itself, that strange and terrible entity that was neither fully alive nor fully dead, but something in between, something that served as a reminder that in Middle-earth, the line between object and subject, between tool and agent, is not as clear as we might wish. And on nights when the moon rises red, when the wind blows cold from the east, travelers in the lands west of Mordor still see, or believe they see, lights gleaming in Cirith Ungol's windows. They still hear, or believe they hear, whispers in the darkness. They still feel, or believe they feel, the weight of an ancient regard, of eyes that watch not with hatred but with something colder, curiosity perhaps, about whether the world beyond the mountains has forgotten, or whether it still remembers the lesson that the tower exists to teach. And the lesson is this: that vigilance is eternal. That light must be tended. That great works, once built, require constant maintenance, constant renewal, lest they corrupt from within. That evil does not only come from without, but can grow in the heart of what was once good if that heart is neglected or abandoned. Every tower that seeks to watch the darkness must itself be watched, lest it become what it was meant to guard against. Every prison must have wardens who remember that they are meant to keep evil in, not to become evil themselves. Every structure built to serve must be regularly reminded of its purpose, lest it begin to serve only itself. These are hard truths, uncomfortable truths. They require from us an exhausting level of vigilance, a constant questioning of our institutions and ourselves. It would be easier, certainly, to believe that once we have built something good, it will remain good. That once we have defeated evil, it stays defeated. But Cirith Ungol stands as testimony to the falsity of that comfort. It reminds us that the battle is never truly over, that vigilance cannot be relaxed, that every generation must choose anew to maintain what was built or risk watching it decay into something terrible. This is the weight of Tolkien's vision, not that evil is invincible, for it is not, but that it is persistent, that it adapts, transforms, finds new paths and new forms, that places and structures and even ideas can be corrupted if they are not tended, and that the price of maintaining a good and just world is eternal effort, eternal watchfulness, eternal willingness to confront darkness wherever it emerges, even in the heart of what we ourselves have built. The tower waits. In the shadow of the Ethel Jueth, beneath the red moon, Cirith Ungol stands, empty but not silent, diminished but not destroyed, a monument to what was and a warning of what might be again, if ever the watch is abandoned, if ever the vigilance fails. And in its waiting lies the final truth, that some evils leave marks that time alone cannot erase, that the stones remember, that the land remembers, that Middle-earth itself remembers in the bedrock and the bones, in the wind through the ruins and the light that will not touch certain shadows. Cirith Ungol remembers, and it waits. In the end, even the eyes of Mordor could not bear to look upon what they had built. The gates stand open now. The webs have grown brittle with age. The stones, once black as midnight, have faded to gray. But on nights when the moon rises red and the wind carries the scent of ash from Gorgoroth, those who have the sight claim they can still see it, not the ruin as it is, but the tower as it was. As it is in some realm beyond the physical where architecture achieves permanence not through endurance but through memory. And in that realm, Cirith Ungol stands eternal, a fortress of darkness, a prison of stone, a watcher that does not sleep. The chroniclers have set down their pens. The tale is told. But stories like this do not truly end. They echo, they persist. They wait like the tower itself for those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. For Cirith Ungol is more than history. It is prophecy. It is warning. It is the price of negligence made manifest in stone. And it will stand in one form or another For as long as beings of light build structures, and then in weariness or pride or simple distraction turn their gaze away, the tower remembers. The stones remember. Do you? Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.